The dust cloud rising from the western trail caught Sophia Fenwick's attention as she stood on the veranda of her father's grand ranch house, her hand shielding her eyes from the harsh May sun of 1882. She had been watching the horizon for nearly an hour, not because she expected anything in particular, but because the alternative was another afternoon listening to her stepmother prattle on about the upcoming social season and which wealthy ranchers' sons might make suitable husbands. At 22 years old, Sophia had weathered 5 years of such conversations, and her patience had worn thinner than cheesecloth. The rider emerged from the dust like something conjured from her imagination, tall and lean in the saddle, his hat pulled low against the glare. He moved with the easy grace of someone who had spent more time on horseback than on foot, and even from this distance, Sophia could see he carried himself differently than the ranch hands her father employed. There was something untethered about him, something that made her heart quicken in a way she could not quite explain. "Sophia Catherine Fenwick, you get yourself inside this instant," her stepmother's shrill voice called from the doorway. "It is absolutely unseemly for a young woman of your standing to be gawking at every saddle tramp who happens to ride past. What would your father say?" Sophia did not turn around. "I imagine father would say that observing who approaches the property is simply good sense, Margaret. After all, someone needs to notice these things while he is in town conducting business." The rider had reached the main gate now, and Sophia watched as the foreman, old Henry Crawford, walked out to meet him. They spoke for a moment, Henry gesturing toward the bunkhouse, and the stranger dismounted in one fluid motion. His horse was a beautiful bay mare, dusty from travel but clearly well cared for. The man removed his hat to wipe his brow, revealing dark hair that needed cutting and a face weathered by sun and wind. He could not have been more than 25 or 26, she guessed, young but clearly seasoned by a hard life on the trail. Something about the set of his shoulders, the way he stood with his weight balanced evenly, spoke of quiet confidence rather than arrogance. Sophia found herself wanting to know his story, to understand what circumstances had brought him to the Fenwick Ranch, the largest and most prosperous spread in Jordan Valley, Oregon. "That girl will be the death of me," Margaret muttered behind her, but Sophia heard the rustle of skirts as her stepmother retreated back into the cool darkness of the house. She knew she should follow, should attend to the needlework that sat unfinished in her room, or practice the piano pieces that her stepmother insisted she perfect. Instead, she descended the veranda steps and made her way toward the barn, taking the long route that would bring her past the spot where Henry still spoke with the newcomer. "Mr. Garrett Thornton, madam," Henry said as she approached, his weathered face creasing with disapproval at her presence. "Says he is looking for work. I told him we might have a spot for an extra hand with the spring branding still underway." Garrett Thornton turned to face her, and Sophia felt the full impact of his gaze. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray with flecks of blue, and they held a depth that suggested he had seen more of life than most men twice his age. He did not stare at her with the hungry calculation she had grown accustomed to from the men her stepmother paraded before her, nor did he look away with the obsequious deference the ranch hands showed. Instead, he simply nodded respectfully. "Madam," he said, his voice low and rough like gravel underfoot, "I do not mean to intrude. I will work for fair wages and keep to myself." "Where are you coming from, Mr. Thornton?" Sophia asked, ignoring Henry's pointed cough of warning. She knew the foreman would report this conversation to her father, but she found she did not care. "Most recently from Montana," Garrett replied. "Before that, Wyoming, Colorado, Texas. I have been drifting since I was 18, picking up work where I can find it. I am good with horses and cattle, and I can mend fence, work leather, and handle most anything else that needs doing on a ranch. Why do you drift? The question escaped before Sophia could consider whether it was appropriate. Surely you could find permanent employment somewhere if you are as skilled as you claim. Something flickered in those gray eyes, a shadow of old pain quickly masked. I suppose I have not yet found a reason to stop moving, madam. Some men are born to put down roots. Others are meant to keep searching. Searching for what? I will know it when I find it. Henry cleared his throat loudly. Miss Fenwick, your father would not approve of you standing out here in this heat. Why do not you let me handle the hiring of hands? Sophia wanted to argue, wanted to continue this strange conversation that felt like the first interesting thing to happen to her in months, but she recognized the wisdom in Henry's words. Her father, Charles Fenwick, ruled his empire with an iron fist, and that rule extended to his daughter's behavior. She was expected to be the perfect lady, the crown jewel of his success, a prize to be offered to the son of another wealthy rancher to forge alliances and expand holdings. The fact that she might have her own desires, her own dreams, had never entered into his calculations. Of course, Henry, she said with as much grace as she could muster. I was simply on my way to check on Juniper. She seemed to be favoring her left foreleg yesterday. I will have Sam take a look at her, Henry said firmly, making it clear that Sophia's presence was no longer required. As she walked away, Sophia could feel Garrett Thornton's eyes following her, and she fought the urge to look back. There was no logical reason why this drifter should interest her more than any of the other hands her father employed. Perhaps it was simply the tedium of her constrained life making her grasp at any novelty. Or perhaps it was something deeper, something that recognized a kindred restlessness in this man who kept searching for something he could not name. The house felt stifling when she returned, all heavy curtains and dark wood, built to impress rather than to comfort. Her father had constructed it 10 years ago when his fortune was secured, modeling it after the grand estates he had seen on a trip east. It stood as a monument to his success, a constant reminder to everyone in Jordan Valley that Charles Fenwick had clawed his way up from nothing and now commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Sophia retreated to her room, but concentration proved impossible. She found herself at the window, watching as Garrett Thornton was led to the bunkhouse by Henry. The other hands were out with the cattle, but they would return at dusk, and she wondered how they would receive this newcomer. Ranch life had its own social hierarchies and codes, and drifters were often viewed with suspicion by men who had steady positions. The afternoon crept by with excruciating slowness. Sophia attempted her needlework, managed a few lines of a letter to her childhood friend who had married and moved to Sacramento, and finally gave up all pretense of productivity. When the dinner bell rang, she descended to find her father had returned from town, his face flushed with satisfaction. "Margaret, Sophia," he announced as he took his seat at the head of the massive dining table. "I have excellent news. Thomas Wellington and his son Matthew will be joining us for dinner on Saturday. It is time we solidified our relationship with the Wellington Ranch." Matthew has expressed considerable interest in getting to know Sophia better. Sophia's stomach turned. Matthew Wellington was 34 years old, had buried 2 wives already, and possessed all the charm of a wounded bear. He was also the sole heir to the second-largest ranch in the territory, which made him, in her father's eyes, the perfect match. "Father, I have told you I have no interest in Matthew Wellington," she said quietly, knowing it was futile but unable to remain silent. Charles Fenwick's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and his eyes narrowed. "What you want, daughter, is of little consequence. You will be gracious, you will be charming, and you will accept his courtship when he offers it. This family has worked too hard to let foolish romantic notions stand in the way of a strategic alliance." "I am not a business asset to be traded," Sophia said, her voice stronger now despite the trembling in her hands. "You are exactly that," her father replied coldly. "You are a Fenwick, and you will do your duty to this family. I did not build this empire so that you could throw it away on sentiment. You have no idea what it took to get here, what I sacrificed. You owe me this." Margaret laid a hand on Charles's arm. "Now, dear, I am sure Sophia simply needs time to understand what an excellent match this would be. Matthew is mature, established, and would provide her with a comfortable life. What more could a girl want? What more indeed?" Sophia murmured, pushing food around her plate without eating. That night, she lay awake long after the house had gone silent, staring at the ceiling and feeling the walls of her gilded cage pressing closer. She had always known this day would come, had always understood that her father saw her as a means to an end rather than a person with her own hopes and dreams. But knowing it and facing it were two different things entirely. When sleep finally came, she dreamed of dust clouds on the horizon and storm-gray eyes. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and Sophia rose early, dressing in her riding clothes before anyone else stirred. She had discovered long ago that the early morning hours offered her only real freedom, a brief window when she could escape the house and ride across her father's land without Margaret's disapproval or her father's controlling presence. She saddled Juniper herself, checking the mare's foreleg and finding it sound, then mounted and headed west toward the section of the ranch where the cattle were being gathered for branding. It was improper for her to be there, of course, but Sophia had grown weary of propriety. If her father was going to force her into marriage with Matthew Wellington, she would at least have these last few weeks of relative liberty. The morning air carried the scent of sage and dust, and the land stretched out before her in rolling hills dotted with cattle, and the occasional stand of juniper trees. This was the Oregon high desert, harsh and beautiful in equal measure, and despite everything, Sophia loved it with a fierce passion. She had been born here, had grown up learning to ride before she could properly walk, and the land was in her blood in a way that the fancy finishing school her father had sent her to could never erase. She found the branding operation in full swing, the air thick with smoke and the bawling of cattle. The ranch hands worked with efficient coordination, roping and branding the calves while keeping the anxious mothers at bay. It was hot, dirty, dangerous work, and Sophia watched from a distance, not wanting to interfere but unable to tear herself away from the spectacle. It was there that she saw Garrett Thornton again, working alongside the other hands as though he had been part of the crew for years rather than days. He moved with that same fluid grace she had noticed before, anticipating the movements of the cattle and his horse with an almost preternatural awareness. When a calf broke free from the group, he was after it in an instant, his rope spinning out to catch the animal with perfect accuracy. "Miss Fenwick," a voice said behind her, and Sophia turned to find Henry approaching on his horse, his expression disapproving. "You should not be out here. This is no place for a lady." "I am perfectly safe, Henry," she replied. "I am merely observing. Your father would not approve." "My father approves of very little I do these days," Sophia said with more bitterness than she intended. "What is one more transgression?" Henry's weathered face softened slightly. He had known her since she was a child, had taught her to ride and rope despite her father's objections. "I know things seem difficult right now, Miss Sophia, but your father only wants what is best for you. He wants what is best for his ranch and his legacy, Sophia corrected. I simply happen to be a convenient tool to achieve those ends. Before Henry could respond, a commotion erupted in the branding area. One of the mother cows, larger and more aggressive than the others, had broken through the line and was charging toward a young hand who had gotten separated from the group. The boy, who could not have been more than 16, froze in panic as 2,000 pounds of furious bovine bore down on him. Garrett Thornton reacted without hesitation. He drove his horse between the charging cow and the boy, using his mount's body to deflect the animal's charge. The cow hooked with her horns, catching Garrett's leg and nearly unseating him, but he held firm, giving the boy time to scramble to safety. Other hands rushed to help, turning the cow back toward the herd, and the crisis ended as quickly as it had begun. Sophia urged Juniper forward without thinking, reaching the group just as Garrett dismounted. His trouser leg was torn and blood seeped through the fabric, but he waved off the concerns of the other hands. "It is nothing," he said, "just a graze." "You need to have that looked at," Sophia said, dismounting as well. "Cow horns are filthy. If it gets infected, I have had worse, madam," Garrett interrupted, but his face had gone slightly pale beneath his tan. "I will clean it up when we break for lunch." "You will clean it up now," Sophia said firmly, channeling every bit of her father's authoritative tone. "Henry, send someone to the house for bandages and carbolic. I will tend to this myself." "Miss Sophia, that would not be proper," Henry protested. "Henry, this man just saved young Tommy's life. I think propriety can wait while we ensure he does not lose his leg to infection. Now send for those supplies." There was a long moment when she thought Henry might refuse, might insist on escorting her back to the house and away from the situation. But something in her expression must have convinced him, because he nodded curtly and dispatched one of the hands back to the ranch house. Sophia led Garrett to the shade of a nearby juniper stand, away from the noise and dust of the branding operation. He moved stiffly, and she suspected the injury was worse than he was letting on, but he did not complain. When they reached the shade, he lowered himself to the ground with a barely suppressed grunt of pain. "You did not have to do this, madam," he said, as Sophia knelt beside him. "I have been tending my own injuries for years." "Nevertheless, you are going to let me help," she replied. "Consider it payment for your bravery. That was an incredibly foolish and incredibly heroic thing you did." "The boy would have been killed," Garrett said simply, as though that explained everything. Sophia carefully rolled up his torn trouser leg, revealing a deep gash about 6 inches long. It was still bleeding freely, and she could see dirt and debris embedded in the wound. When the supplies arrived, she set to work cleaning it with an efficiency that surprised even herself, using water from a canteen to rinse away the worst of the filth before applying the carbolic solution. Garrett hissed through his teeth at the sting but otherwise remained still, watching her work with those storm-gray eyes. "You have done this before," he observed. "I grew up on this ranch," Sophia replied, concentrating on wrapping the bandage securely. "My mother, before she died, believed I should know how to handle myself in the world, not just in a parlor. She taught me basic medical care, animal husbandry, even how to shoot and rope. My father was too busy building his empire to notice, and by the time he did, the knowledge was already part of me. He could send me to finishing school, could teach me which fork to use and how to walk with a book on my head, but he could not erase what my mother had given me." "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," Sophia said softly. "She died when I was 12, a fever that came on sudden and took her in 3 days. My father remarried within the year, and Margaret has been trying to turn me into the perfect society lady ever since." "Seems to me you are remarkable enough as you are," Garrett said quietly. Sophia's hand stilled, and she looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was no flattery in his words, no calculated attempt at seduction. He simply stated it as fact, as though he could see past all the layers of propriety and expectation to the person she truly was beneath. "You do not even know me," she whispered. "I know you risked your father's displeasure to come out here to watch honest work being done," Garrett replied. "I know you did not hesitate to help when you saw someone needed tending. I know you have sadness in your eyes that has nothing to do with your mother's death and everything to do with the cage you are living in. That is enough to know you are remarkable. How can you possibly see all that?" "Because I recognize it," he said. "I spent the first 18 years of my life in a cage too, just a different kind. A hardscrabble farm in Missouri, a father who thought the only way to make a man of his son was to beat the softness out of him, a future that stretched ahead like a prison sentence. So I left, walked away one morning and never looked back. I have been drifting ever since, and some folks think that makes me a coward or a failure, but at least I am free." "That must be wonderful," Sophia said, finishing the bandage and sitting back. "To just walk away from everything and go wherever you choose." "It is lonely," Garrett admitted. "Free, but lonely. I have been searching for 8 years now, and I still have not found whatever it is I am looking for. Sometimes I wonder if I ever will." Their eyes met and held, and something passed between them in that moment, some recognition that transcended words. Sophia felt it settle in her chest like a living thing, warm and terrifying in equal measure. "Miss Sophia," Henry called from nearby, his tone making it clear that her time was up. "Your father will be wondering where you have gotten to." The spell broke, and Sophia rose quickly, suddenly aware of how improper this entire situation was. She had been alone with a man, touching him, speaking to him with an intimacy she had never shared with anyone. If her father found out, there would be consequences beyond imagining. "Thank you for your help, madam," Garrett said, getting to his feet with only a slight wince. "I will remember your kindness." "Change that bandage tonight and keep it clean," Sophia replied, trying to sound businesslike and professional. "If you see any red streaks or if it starts to swell, you need to see a proper doctor immediately." "Yes, madam." She mounted Juniper and rode back toward the house with Henry, acutely aware of Garrett's gaze following her until she disappeared over the ridge. Her hands trembled slightly on the reins, and her heart beat too fast in her chest. She told herself it was simply the excitement of the emergency, the satisfaction of helping someone in need. But she knew, deep in a part of herself she had tried to ignore, that it was something far more dangerous than that. The rest of the week passed in a blur of preparation for the dreaded dinner with the Wellingtons. Margaret was in her element, ordering the household staff about, planning the menu down to the last detail, and reminding Sophia every few hours about the importance of making a good impression. Sophia endured it all with the stoic resignation of a prisoner awaiting execution. She found excuses to ride out to watch the ranch work whenever possible, always maintaining a proper distance but unable to stop herself from seeking out the sight of Garrett Thornton among the hands. She told herself she was simply ensuring his injury was healing properly, but the flutter in her chest whenever she spotted him told a different story. She noticed that the other hands had accepted him quickly, drawn by his competence and his willingness to take on the hardest jobs without complaint. He never shirked, never boasted, simply did what needed doing with quiet efficiency. More than once, she saw him helping the younger hands, teaching them tricks for managing difficult cattle, or showing them how to repair tack properly. On Thursday afternoon, she was in the barn checking on one of the horses when Garrett entered, leading his bay mare. He stopped when he saw her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "How is your leg?" Sophia asked finally, hating how formal her voice sounded. "Healing clean, thanks to you," Garrett replied. "I changed the bandage like you said, no infection. I am glad." The barn felt suddenly very small, the air thick with words neither of them dared speak. Sophia knew she should leave, should maintain the proper distance between a rancher's daughter and a hired hand. Instead, she found herself moving closer. "Garrett," she said, using his Christian name for the first time and feeling the intimacy of it like a physical touch. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you left Missouri, when you walked away from that farm and your father, were you afraid?" He considered the question carefully before answering. "Terrified. I had no money, no plan, no idea if I could make it on my own, but I was more afraid of what would happen if I stayed. Sometimes the fear of remaining in a bad situation has to outweigh the fear of the unknown. Otherwise, you just stay trapped forever. What if there are others who would be hurt by your leaving? What if your choices affect more than just yourself?" Garrett's gray eyes searched her face, and she knew he understood exactly what she was really asking. "Then you have to decide whether living for other people's expectations is worth losing yourself entirely. But Sophia, I cannot make that choice for you. No one can." The sound of her name on his lips, without the formal "miss" before it, sent a shiver through her. "My father is trying to marry me off to a man I cannot stand," she said in a rush. "He sees me as a business asset, a way to secure an alliance with another powerful ranch. I have no say in the matter, no choice. This dinner on Saturday is essentially a contract negotiation where I am the commodity being sold." "Then do not go," Garrett said simply. "It is not that simple. If I refuse, my father will make my life unbearable, and more than that, I have nowhere else to go. I have no money of my own, no skills that would allow me to support myself. What am I supposed to do, just walk out the door and hope for the best?" "If you wanted to," Garrett said slowly, carefully. "If you truly wanted to leave, you would not be alone. I cannot offer you much, just a bedroll and whatever wages I can earn drifting from ranch to ranch. But if you wanted freedom badly enough to accept those terms, I would help you." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "You barely know me. Why would you risk your position here, risk my father's wrath, for a woman you met less than a week ago?" "Because when I look at you, I see someone I have been searching for without knowing it," Garrett replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Because when you knelt beside me under that juniper tree and tended my wound with such care, I felt something I have not felt since I left home 8 years ago. I felt like maybe I could stop drifting, like maybe I had found a reason to put down roots. And because I can see that you are dying by inches in that big house, being slowly suffocated by expectations and duty, and I cannot stand by and watch that happen if there is anything I can do to help." "You are offering to help me run away," Sophia said, trying to make it real in her mind. "To leave everything I have ever known, everyone I have ever cared about, and just disappear into the wilderness with a man I barely know. That is madness." "Yes," Garrett agreed, "complete madness. But is it any more mad than spending the rest of your life married to a man you cannot stand, living a life that is not yours, slowly losing every part of yourself that makes you who you are?" Sophia pressed her hands to her face, her mind reeling. Everything he said was true, struck at the very heart of the desperation that had been building in her for years. But to actually do it, to actually walk away from her father and the life he had planned for her, required a kind of courage she was not sure she possessed. "I need to think," she whispered. "This is too big, too much." "Of course," Garrett said gently. "I will be here working until your father decides he no longer needs me or I decide to move on. Whatever you choose, Sophia, I will respect it, but know that the offer stands. If you want freedom, I will help you find it. She fled the barn then, her emotions too chaotic to process. Back in her room, she paced like a caged animal, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. If she ran away with Garrett, her father would never forgive her. He might even come after them, use his considerable resources and influence to track them down. She would be giving up comfort and security for a life of hardship and uncertainty. But she would be free. She would be choosing her own path, living on her own terms. And she would be with a man who, in just a few short days, had seen her more clearly than anyone in her entire life. Saturday arrived too quickly, bringing with it the Wellington dinner and all the dread Sophia had been trying to suppress. She dressed in the gown Margaret had selected, a confection of blue silk and lace that was far too elaborate for a simple dinner, but perfectly calculated to impress their guests. Her hair was styled in an elaborate updo that pulled at her scalp, and Margaret insisted she wear the sapphire necklace that had belonged to Charles's mother. "You look perfect," Margaret said with satisfaction as she surveyed the final result. "Matthew Wellington will not be able to resist you." "That is what I am afraid of," Sophia muttered, but her stepmother either did not hear or chose to ignore the comment. The Wellingtons arrived precisely on time, Thomas looking pompous in his expensive suit, and Matthew looking bored and vaguely predatory. He was a large man, running to fat around the middle, with thinning hair and small eyes that assessed Sophia with the same expression he might use to evaluate a horse he was considering purchasing. "Miss Fenwick," he said, taking her hand and holding it far too long. "You are even lovelier than I remembered. That gown suits you admirably." "Thank you, Mr. Wellington," Sophia replied, extracting her hand as quickly as politeness allowed. "I trust your journey was pleasant." "Pleasant enough," Matthew said, his eyes never leaving her face. "Though any journey would be worth it for the opportunity to spend an evening in your company." The flattery felt oily and insincere, and Sophia had to suppress a shudder. Dinner was an elaborate affair, course after course of rich food that Sophia could barely choke down. The conversation revolved around ranch business, territorial politics, and thinly veiled discussions of the benefits a merger between the Fenwick and Wellington holdings would bring. Of course, such alliances are best sealed through family connections, Thomas Wellington said as the main course was cleared away. "My Matthew has been looking for a suitable wife, someone with the grace and breeding befitting his position. He buried his second wife 3 years ago, and it is time he remarried and produced an heir to carry on the Wellington name." "Your previous wives," Sophia said, unable to help herself. "How did they die?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Margaret's face went white, and Charles's expression darkened with fury. "The first died in childbirth," Matthew said after a moment, his voice flat. "The second succumbed to pneumonia. Both tragedies, of course, but such is life on the frontier. A man must be practical and move forward." "How very practical of you," Sophia said, her tone making it unclear whether she was being sincere or sarcastic. After dinner, Charles maneuvered the conversation so that Sophia and Matthew were left alone in the parlor while the others retired to his study for brandy and cigars. It was a transparent ploy to give Matthew time to court her properly, and Sophia felt trapped as effectively as if the door had been barred. "You have a lovely home," Matthew said, settling himself on the sofa uncomfortably close to her chair. "Though I think you will find the Wellington ranch house even more impressive. It has 20 rooms, the finest furnishings money can buy." "How wonderful," Sophia said, her voice hollow. "I will be honest with you, Miss Fenwick," Matthew continued, leaning forward. I am not a man for pretty words and drawn-out courtships. I know what I want and I go after it directly. I want you as my wife. You are young, healthy, beautiful, and come from good stock. You will give me strong sons to inherit my ranch. In return, you will want for nothing materially. I am a generous man with my wives, as long as they understand their place and perform their duties. Sophia felt bile rise in her throat. You speak as though you are purchasing a broodmare, Mr. Wellington. I speak as a practical man, he replied, not seeming to recognize the insult. Love is for fools and poets. A good marriage is a business arrangement that benefits both parties. You gain security and position, I gain a wife and heirs. It is simple, clean, effective. And what if I refuse? Sophia asked, her heart pounding. Matthew's expression hardened slightly. Your father has already agreed to the match. He gave me his word that you would be an obedient and dutiful wife. I have no reason to doubt him. Women sometimes need time to adjust to such arrangements, but they always come around in the end. They have no other choice. The casual certainty in his voice, the absolute assurance that she was already his property to command, sparked something fierce and angry in Sophia's chest. This was her future if she stayed. Not a marriage, but an ownership. Her body and her life signed over to this man who saw her as nothing more than a means to produce heirs. "Excuse me," she said, standing abruptly. "I need some air." She fled to the veranda before he could stop her, gasping in the cool night air like a drowning person breaking the surface. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the ranch yard, and in the distance she could see the warm glow of lanterns in the bunkhouse where the hands were settling in for the night. The door opened behind her, and Sophia tensed, expecting Matthew. But it was her father who emerged, his face dark with anger. "What do you think you are doing?" he demanded in a harsh whisper. "You embarrass me in there with your questions and your behavior." Matthew Wellington is one of the most eligible men in the territory, and you treated him with barely concealed contempt. "He is a terrible man who sees me as livestock," Sophia shot back. "And you are trying to sell me to him to expand your empire." "I am trying to secure your future," Charles hissed. "You think I built all of this just so you could throw it away? You are my only child, Sophia. When I die, everything I have worked for dies with me unless you marry well and produce grandchildren to carry on the Fenwick name. This is not about what you want. This is about legacy, about family duty." "It is about control," Sophia said, her voice shaking. "It is about you treating me exactly the way you treat your cattle and your horses, as property to be managed and disposed of as you see fit. I am a person, father. I have thoughts and feelings and dreams of my own." "Dreams," Charles spat the word like a curse. "Dreams are for children. You are a woman grown, and it is time you accepted reality. You will marry Matthew Wellington, you will move to his ranch, and you will give him the sons he requires. That is the end of this discussion. And if I refuse," Charles moved closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "then you will find yourself with nothing. No home, no money, no family. I will disown you completely. You will be dead to me, do you understand? I will not have a disobedient daughter dragging the Fenwick name through the mud with her selfish rebellion. You will do your duty, or you will be cast out with nothing but the clothes on your back. Choose." Sophia stared at her father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in her life. She had always known he was hard, that he valued power and success above all else. But she had never truly understood until this moment that he was incapable of loving her as a person rather than as an asset. To him, she was just another resource to be exploited for the benefit of his empire. "Then I choose to be cast out," she said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, and she saw shock flicker across her father's face before it hardened into fury. You are hysterical, he said flatly. You do not know what you are saying. Go to your room and compose yourself. We will discuss this in the morning when you have come to your senses. I have never been more sensible in my life, Sophia replied. I will not marry Matthew Wellington. I will not be sold like a prize heifer to the highest bidder. If that means you disown me, then so be it. She turned and walked back into the house before he could respond, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She went straight to her room and locked the door, then stood in the middle of the floor, shaking from head to toe. She had done it. She had actually defied her father, had chosen freedom over security. And now she had to follow through, had to find the courage to leave before he could force her into compliance. Moving quickly, before she could lose her nerve, Sophia changed out of the elaborate gown and into her most practical riding clothes. She gathered what few possessions she could carry, focusing on necessities rather than sentiment. Her mother's silver locket went around her neck, and she took the small amount of money she had managed to save over the years from birthday gifts and the like. It was not much, perhaps $50, but it was something. She waited until the house was dark and quiet, until she was certain her father and the Wellingtons had retired for the night. Then she crept down the back stairs and out through the kitchen door, moving like a ghost through the moonlit yard toward the barn. Her hands shook as she saddled Juniper, and her mind raced with second thoughts. What was she doing? Where would she go? How would she survive? But then, she remembered Matthew Wellington's cold eyes and casual certainty that she was already his property. Remembered her father's absolute refusal to see her as anything more than a business asset, and her resolve hardened. She led Juniper out of the barn and had just mounted when a voice spoke from the shadows. I hoped you would come. Garrett Thornton stepped into the moonlight, leading his bay mare, already packed and ready to travel. He was dressed for the trail, his bedroll and supplies secured behind his saddle. You were waiting for me, Sophia said, her voice barely above a whisper. I saw the look on your face when the Wellingtons arrived, Garrett replied. And I know your father's reputation well enough to guess what kind of ultimatum he would deliver. I figured if you were going to run, tonight would be the night. I got my wages from Henry this afternoon and told him I would be moving on. He was not happy, but he paid me what was owed. If you come with me, my father will hunt us both, Sophia warned. He will see it as theft, me leaving with one of his hands. He might even try to have you arrested or worse. Let him try, Garrett said simply. I have been running from one thing or another my whole life. At least this time I will be running towards something instead of just away. But Sophia, you need to be sure. Once we leave, there is no going back. Your father meant what he said about disowning you. Are you ready for that? Sophia looked back at the grand house that had been her prison for so long, thought of the life that awaited her if she stayed, and then looked at Garrett, at the freedom and possibility he represented. I am ready, she said. Let's go. They rode out together into the moonlit night, heading west toward the mountains and the vast unknown beyond. Behind them, the Fenwick ranch gradually disappeared into the darkness, and with it, everything Sophia had ever known. The first few hours passed in tense silence, both of them expecting at any moment to hear the sound of pursuit. They pushed the horses as hard as they dared without injuring them, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the ranch. Only when the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky did they finally slow to a walk, allowing the horses to rest. We need to be smart about this, Garrett said as they paused to let the horses drink from a small stream. Your father will send men after us as soon as he discovers you are gone. We cannot stick to the main trails or go to any of the larger towns where people might recognize you. We need to head into the back country, places where his influence does not reach. Where are we going? Sophia asked, the reality of what she had done beginning to sink in now that the adrenaline of escape was fading. I have a friend who runs a small ranch up near the Idaho border, Garrett said. It is rough country, isolated, but he is a good man who does not ask too many questions. We can stay there for a while, work for our keep, let things cool down. After that, well, we will figure it out as we go. That is not much of a plan, Sophia observed. No, Garrett agreed, but it is all we have. I am sorry I cannot offer you more, Sophia. I know this is not what you are accustomed to. Sophia looked at him, at the genuine regret in his storm-gray eyes, and felt something warm bloom in her chest. I did not leave for comfort and security, Garrett. I left because I would rather face an uncertain future as a free person than a certain future as someone's property. Whatever happens from here, at least it will be my choice. They traveled for 3 more days, keeping to game trails and avoiding settlements. They rationed the food Garrett had brought and supplemented it with fish from the streams they crossed. At night, they made cold camps without fires that might give away their position, and Garrett insisted they take turns keeping watch. It was exhausting, uncomfortable, and often frightening, but Sophia found herself more alive than she had felt in years. Everything was immediate and real, stripped of the artificial layers of society and expectation. When she was hungry, she ate. When she was tired, she slept. And through it all, Garrett was there, steady and patient, teaching her the skills she would need to survive this new life. On the 4th day, as they made their way through a narrow canyon, disaster struck. A rattlesnake, coiled in the shade of a rock, struck at Juniper as they passed. The mare reared in panic, and Sophia, tired and not as alert as she should have been, lost her seat. She hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from her lungs, and felt a sharp pain in her wrist as she tried to break her fall. Garrett was off his horse in an instant, kneeling beside her. Sophia, do not move. Let me check if anything is broken. She lay still while his hands carefully probed her arms and legs, his touch gentle but thorough. When he reached her right wrist, she hissed in pain. I think it might be sprained, maybe broken, Garrett said, his face grim. We need to get it stabilized. Can you sit up? With his help, Sophia managed to get upright, cradling her injured wrist against her chest. The pain was sharp and immediate, bringing tears to her eyes that she tried to blink away. This is foolish, she said through gritted teeth. I am slowing you down, putting you in danger. You should leave me somewhere safe and go on alone. Not a chance, Garrett replied firmly. He was already pulling supplies from his pack, fashioning a splint from straight branches and strips torn from an old shirt. We are in this together now. Besides, I am not about to abandon the first person I have cared about in 8 years just because things get difficult. His words penetrated the haze of pain, and Sophia looked at him with wide eyes. You care about me. Of course I do, Garrett said, focusing intently on wrapping her wrist. I would not have helped you run away from your father if I did not. I would not be risking everything to keep you safe if I did not. I know we have not known each other long, and I know this probably seems sudden, but Sophia, from the moment I saw you standing on that veranda watching the horizon, I felt something I have never felt before, like I had been searching for you my whole life without knowing it. I feel it too, Sophia whispered. It terrifies me how quickly this has happened, how much I have come to depend on you, but I cannot deny it. When I am with you, even cold and tired and injured in the middle of nowhere, I feel more like myself than I ever did in my father's house. Garrett finished securing the splint and looked up at her, his gray eyes intense. Then we will make this work somehow. I cannot promise you comfort or security, but I can promise you that I will do everything in my power to keep you safe and to give you the freedom you deserve." "That is all I need," Sophia said, and leaned forward to kiss him. It was not a gentle, tentative first kiss. It was fierce and desperate, born of fear and pain, and the overwhelming relief of finding something real in a world that had always felt artificial. Garrett kissed her back with equal intensity, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other still carefully holding her injured wrist. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "We should keep moving," he said reluctantly. "We are still too close to your father's reach." "I know," Sophia replied, "but thank you for this moment, for making me feel like a person instead of a possession." They traveled more slowly after that, Garrett leading Juniper while Sophia rode his bay mare, her injured wrist cradled against her chest. The pain was constant but manageable, and Sophia forced herself to focus on the landscape around them rather than on her discomfort. The country was growing wilder, the cultivated ranchland giving way to rougher terrain dotted with sagebrush and juniper. They saw antelope in the distance, and once spotted a small band of wild horses running free across a high meadow. It was beautiful and harsh in equal measure, and Sophia understood why Garrett had chosen a life of drifting. There was a kind of freedom in this wilderness that existed nowhere else. On the evening of the 5th day, they finally reached the small ranch Garrett had mentioned. It was a humble affair, just a small cabin and a few outbuildings tucked into a protected valley. The man who emerged to greet them was in his 50s, grizzled and weathered, but his face broke into a genuine smile when he saw Garrett. "Garrett Thornton," he called out. "I thought you were working down Jordan Valley way. What brings you up here?" "Trouble, Samuel," Garrett replied, dismounting and helping Sophia down carefully. "The kind that requires a place to lay low for a while. This is Sophia. She is with me." Samuel's eyes, sharp despite his age, took in Sophia's fine clothes now dusty and worn, her splinted wrist, and the exhaustion on both their faces. "Come inside," he said without asking for details. "You both look like you could use a hot meal and a proper rest." Inside the cabin, Samuel's wife Martha clucked over Sophia's wrist, rewrapping it with clean bandages and making her drink willow bark tea for the pain. She asked no questions, simply providing comfort and care with the efficiency of someone used to dealing with trouble. That night, after Sophia had been settled in the spare room and had fallen into an exhausted sleep, Garrett sat with Samuel by the fire and told him the whole story. When he finished, Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "That is a dangerous game you are playing," he said finally. "Charles Fenwick is not a man to cross lightly. He has money, influence, and a reputation for ruthlessness. If he finds you here, he will make trouble for all of us." "I know," Garrett said. "If you want us to leave, I understand. I should not have brought this to your door." "I did not say that," Samuel replied. "I just want you to understand what you are up against. But Martha and we ran away from her family 30 years ago when they tried to force her into a marriage with a man 3 times her age. Her father was a banker in Portland, had plans for her to marry into another wealthy family. We have been on the run from one thing or another ever since, and we have never regretted it. So we will help you, but you need to be realistic about what comes next." "What do you mean?" "You and Sophia cannot just drift forever," Samuel said. "She is not built for that life, no matter how much she thinks she is. And you cannot protect her if you are always on the move, always looking over your shoulder. You need to build something, find a place to make a stand. Otherwise, you are just prolonging the inevitable." "What do you suggest?" "There is land opening up in Idaho, in the Boise Valley. The railroad is coming through, and they are looking for settlers willing to homestead. It is hard work, breaking new land, but if you file a claim and prove it up, that land is yours. No one, not even Charles Fenwick, can take that away from you. You would have a home, a future, something to build on together. Garrett turned the idea over in his mind. He had spent 8 years drifting, never staying anywhere long enough to form attachments. The thought of putting down roots, of claiming a piece of land and fighting to make it productive, should have terrified him. Instead, he felt something like hope stirring in his chest. "I will talk to Sophia," he said. "See what she thinks. But Samuel, I do not have much money. How am I supposed to support her while we are proving up a homestead claim?" "Same way Martha and I did it," Samuel replied. "You work whatever jobs you can find. You help your neighbors and they help you, and you fight for every inch. It is not easy and it is not glamorous, but it is yours. That counts for something." The next morning, Garrett found Sophia outside, watching the sunrise with her injured wrist held carefully against her chest. She looked tired but peaceful, more relaxed than he had seen her since they left. "How are you feeling?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "Sore, exhausted, and happier than I have been in years," Sophia replied. "Is that strange?" "Not at all." Garrett hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Samuel and I were talking last night. He suggested that instead of just drifting, we could file a homestead claim in Idaho. It would be hard work, and it would take years to prove up the claim and really establish ourselves. But it would be ours, Sophia. A place we built together that no one could take away from us." Sophia was quiet for a long moment, and Garrett felt his heart sink, thinking he had overstepped, had assumed too much. "You are talking about a future," she said finally. "A real future, not just running and hiding." "Yes," Garrett said. "I am talking about building a life together, if you want that. I know it is fast, and I know we are still figuring out what this is between us, but Sophia, I do not want to just keep drifting. Not anymore, not with you." "Yes," Sophia said, turning to look at him with tears shining in her eyes. "Yes, I want that. I want to build something with you, something that is ours. I do not care how hard it is or how long it takes. As long as we are together, as long as I am free to make my own choices, I can face anything." Garrett pulled her into his arms, careful of her injured wrist, and held her close. "Then we will do it," he said into her hair. "We will file a claim, we will build a house, and we will make a life that is completely our own." They stayed with Samuel and Martha for 3 weeks, allowing Sophia's wrist time to heal and giving them a chance to plan their next move. During that time, Sophia learned to cook simple meals over an open fire, to mend clothes and tack, and to handle the dozens of small tasks that were part of frontier life. It was humbling, discovering how little her expensive education had prepared her for the practical realities of survival, but she threw herself into learning with fierce determination. Garrett worked alongside Samuel, helping with the ranch work in exchange for their hospitality. In the evenings, he and Sophia would sit together and plan their future, talking about where they would file their claim, what they would need to survive the first year, how they would build their homestead. "We should get married before we leave," Garrett said one evening. "Not because we have to, not because society demands it, but because I want you to know I am committed to this, to us. I want to stand in front of witnesses and pledge myself to you, so there is no doubt in anyone's mind that we chose each other." "I would like that," Sophia said softly. "But Garrett, my father, will never acknowledge it. As far as he is concerned, I am dead to him. There will be no grand wedding, no family celebration, none of the things most brides dream of." "You want those things?" Sophia thought about it honestly before answering. "No. I want something simple and real, something that means something to us rather than being a performance for others. If we can find a preacher willing to marry us, that is enough for me." Samuel knew a circuit preacher who came through the area once a month. and he arranged for the man to stop by the ranch. On a sunny morning in late June, with Martha and Samuel as witnesses, Sophia Fenwick and Garrett Thornton were married in a simple ceremony under the shade of a large juniper tree. Sophia wore her cleanest dress, still dusty from travel but carefully mended. Garrett had shaved and cleaned up as best he could, his dark hair still too long but his eyes bright with joy. They spoke their vows seriously, pledging themselves to each other with a sincerity that made Martha dab at her eyes with her apron. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett kissed Sophia with a tenderness that took her breath away. This was real, she thought. This was her choice, her life, her future, and it was more beautiful than anything her father's money could have bought. That night, in the small cabin's spare room, they consummated their marriage with a mixture of nervousness and desire. Garrett was patient and gentle, taking his time to ensure Sophia's comfort, and when they finally came together it felt like a promise made physical, a seal on the vows they had spoken earlier. Afterward, lying in each other's arms, Sophia felt a peace she had never known. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I know I should have said it before now, should have told you sooner, but I love you, Garrett Thornton." "I love you too," Garrett replied, his hand stroking her hair. "I think I have loved you since I saw you standing on that veranda, looking like you were dreaming of escape. You are the bravest person I have ever met, Sophia. You gave up everything for your freedom, and I promise you will never regret it." A week later, properly married and as prepared as they could be, Garrett and Sophia left Samuel and Martha's ranch with their blessings and enough supplies to get them to Idaho. The journey took another 2 weeks, following rough trails through mountain passes and across high desert plains. They reached the Boise Valley in mid-July, and Sophia had to admit it was some of the most beautiful country she had ever seen. The valley was green with irrigation from the Boise River, surrounded by mountains that still showed snow on their peaks even in the heat of summer. It was wild and largely unsettled, but she could see the potential in every acre. They filed their homestead claim at the land office, 160 acres along a small creek that fed into the Boise River. The land was raw and undeveloped, covered in sagebrush and dotted with rocks, but it had good water and decent soil. With hard work, they could make it productive. The first few months were the hardest of Sophia's life. They lived in a tent while Garrett worked to build a small cabin, one room that would shelter them through the coming winter. Sophia learned to cook over an open fire, to haul water from the creek, to help clear sagebrush and rocks from the land that would become their first fields. Her hands, once soft and carefully tended, became calloused and scarred. Her face tanned despite her best efforts to keep covered. She lost weight from the constant physical labor and simple diet, but she had never been happier. There was a satisfaction in the work that she had never experienced in her father's grand house. Every stone cleared, every post set, every seed planted was a tangible accomplishment, proof that she and Garrett were building something real together. And at the end of each exhausting day, she fell asleep in Garrett's arms, secure in the knowledge that this life was her choice, that every hardship was freely accepted rather than imposed. They met their neighbors, other homesteaders who were equally committed to making a life in this challenging land. There was an unspoken code among these settlers, a willingness to help each other without asking too many questions about where people came from or why they had chosen this hard life. Sophia and Garrett were simply known as the Thorntons, hard-working folks trying to prove up their claim like everyone else. When winter came, fierce and cold, they huddled in their small cabin and survived on the supplies they had managed to put by. Garrett found work when he could, hiring out to larger ranches for winter feeding or cutting firewood to sell in town. Sophia learned to make do with almost nothing, to stretch every resource, to find joy in simple things like a hot meal and a warm fire. Spring arrived like a benediction, and they planted their first crops with hope and determination. Garrett had learned farming as a boy before he ran away, and he put that hard-won knowledge to use. They planted hay for winter feed, vegetables for their own use, and a small field of wheat that they hoped to sell for cash. It was during the planting season that Sophia realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a mixture of joy and terror. They were barely scraping by as it was, living hand to mouth with no security beyond their own hard work. How would they manage with a baby? When she told Garrett, he swept her into his arms and spun her around, laughing with pure delight. "We will manage," he said when he finally set her down. "We will figure it out, just like we have figured out everything else. Our child will grow up free, Sophia, free to make their own choices and live their own life. That is worth any hardship." She held onto those words in the months that followed, as her body changed and the work became more difficult. Their neighbors rallied around them, the women sharing advice and hand-me-down baby clothes, the men helping Garrett with the heaviest work as Sophia grew larger and less able to do the physical labor she had been managing. In February of 1884, nearly 2 years after Sophia had fled her father's ranch, she gave birth to their first child. The labor was long and difficult, attended by 2 neighbor women who had experience with such things. When it was finally over and the baby was placed in her arms, Sophia looked down at her son's red, wrinkled face and felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. "He is perfect," Garrett said, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "Sophia, he is absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" They had discussed names during her pregnancy, but now, holding their son, Sophia knew exactly what he should be called. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Garrett Thornton, after your middle name and to honor the new life we have built." "Thomas," Garrett repeated, carefully taking his son and cradling him with surprising competence for a new father. "Welcome to the world, Thomas. You are going to have a good life, I promise you that." The years that followed were hard but rewarding. They expanded their homestead gradually, proving up their claim and then purchasing adjacent land from other homesteaders who gave up and moved on. Garrett had a gift for working with horses, and he started a small breeding operation that brought in steady income. Sophia kept a large garden and sold vegetables and preserves to the growing town of Boise. Thomas grew into a sturdy, happy child, followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Clara, after Sophia's mother. Then came 2 more boys, Michael and James, each arriving with the same mixture of joy and chaos that Thomas's birth had brought. The small cabin was expanded twice, growing into a proper house with multiple rooms and even glass windows. The raw sagebrush land was transformed into productive fields and pastures. They were never wealthy by Charles Fenwick's standards, but they were comfortable, secure, and above all, free. Sophia sometimes thought about her father, wondered if he had truly disowned her as he had threatened, or if some part of him regretted the daughter he had driven away. She wrote to him once, 3 years after she left, sending the letter care of Samuel and Martha to avoid revealing their location. In it, she told him she was alive and well, married and happy, and that she forgave him for the ways he had tried to control her. She told him she understood he had thought he was acting in her best interest, even if she disagreed with his methods. And she told him she had no regrets, that every hardship she had faced was worth the freedom to live life on her own terms. She never received a reply, and she did not expect one. But writing the letter had brought her a kind of closure, a final severing of the ties that had once bound her to that old life. When Thomas was 6 years old, a stranger appeared at their door one autumn afternoon. He was well dressed, riding a fine horse, clearly not a local homesteader. Sophia felt a flutter of old fear, wondering if somehow her father had tracked them down after all these years. "Mrs. Thornton," the man said, removing his hat politely. "My name is Edward Phillips. I am an attorney from Portland. I have been searching for you for some time. What do you want?" Garrett asked, stepping forward protectively. "I have news regarding Charles Fenwick," Phillips said, his expression grave. "He passed away 3 months ago, heart failure. I am the executor of his estate, and there are matters we need to discuss." Sophia felt the news hit her like a physical blow. Her father was dead, gone. She would never have the chance to reconcile, to show him the life she had built, to prove that her choice had been the right one. She found herself crying, not for the man Charles Fenwick had been, but for the father he might have been if he had been capable of loving her as a person rather than as a possession. "I am sorry for your loss," Phillips continued, "but there is more. Mr. Fenwick never changed his will after you left. You remain his sole heir. The ranch, all his holdings, everything passes to you." Sophia stared at the lawyer in shock. "That cannot be right. He disowned me. He told me I was dead to him." "He said those words, yes," Phillips replied. "I spoke with his staff, with the people who knew him. But he never legally disinherited you. In fact, according to his housekeeper, he kept a photograph of you on his desk until the day he died. Whatever he said in anger, I do not think he ever truly let you go. What does this mean?" Garrett asked quietly. "It means you are now one of the wealthiest women in Oregon," Phillips said. "The ranch alone is worth a fortune, not to mention his other holdings and investments. You would need to return to Jordan Valley to claim your inheritance, to take control of the estate." Sophia looked at Garrett, at their modest but comfortable home, at Thomas playing in the yard with his siblings, and then back at the lawyer. "I do not want it," she said firmly. "Sell the ranch, sell everything. Use the money to establish a trust for my children's education and future. Set aside a generous pension for the ranch staff who remained loyal to my father. Give a substantial donation to the church in Jordan Valley for community improvements. But I do not want to go back there, and I do not want to live off my father's legacy." "Sophia," Garrett said softly. "Are you certain? That is an enormous amount of money. It would make life so much easier for us, for our children." "I am certain," Sophia replied. "We built this life together, Garrett, without my father's money or approval. It is ours, and it is real, and I would not trade it for anything. The money can help our children when they are grown, can give them opportunities we never had. But I do not want it to change who we are or how we live." Phillips looked between them with something like admiration. "That is a remarkably principled decision, Mrs. Thornton." "Very well, I will arrange everything as you have requested. It will take some time to liquidate the estate and set up the trust, but I will ensure your wishes are carried out." After he left, Garrett pulled Sophia into his arms. "You continue to amaze me," he said. "Most people would have jumped at the chance to reclaim that wealth and comfort." "Most people did not leave it by choice," Sophia replied. "I know what I gave up when I left my father's house, and I know what I gained. This life, hard as it sometimes is worth more to me than all the money in the world. We built this together, through our own efforts and our own choices. That is what makes it valuable." They never did return to Jordan Valley. The estate was settled by correspondence, the money placed in trust as Sophia had requested. Life went on much as it had before, with hard work and simple pleasures, with children growing and dreams being realized one small step at a time. Years passed, and their children grew. Thomas took after his father, showing a natural talent for working with horses. He eventually started his own breeding operation on land adjacent to the family homestead. Clara proved to have a gift for teaching and became a schoolteacher in Boise, beloved by her students. Michael and James worked the family farm together, expanding it slowly and carefully, always remembering the lessons of hard work and perseverance their parents had taught them. Garrett's hair turned silver at the temples, and Sophia's face showed the lines of a life well lived. They grew old together, working side by side as they always had, supporting each other through the challenges that come with age and time. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the house they had built together, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Sophia reflected on the path her life had taken. "You ever regret it?" Garrett asked, as though reading her thoughts. "Leaving everything behind, living this hard life instead of the comfortable one you could have had?" "Not for a single moment," Sophia replied, taking his weathered hand in hers. "Every choice I made, every hardship I faced led me to this. To you, to our children, to a life that is truly mine. My father wanted to control my future, to mold me into what he thought I should be. But instead, I found my own path. I found freedom and love and purpose. What could I possibly regret about that? We did good, did we not?" Garrett said softly. "Built something worth having, raised children who know their own minds." "We did very good," Sophia agreed. "We proved that love and determination can build a life just as solid as money and power ever could. Maybe more so because this is real. Every board in this house, every fence post on this land, every memory in these walls, we built it together. It is ours in a way nothing purchased could ever be." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of family, their grown children gathered for Sunday dinner, their grandchildren playing and laughing. This was the legacy they had built together, not of wealth or power, but of love and freedom and the courage to choose their own path. In the end, Charles Fenwick's greatest fear had come true. His daughter had rejected everything he offered, had walked away from his carefully constructed empire without a backward glance. But in doing so, she had built something far more valuable than he could ever have imagined. She had built a life of her own choosing, raised children who understood that freedom was worth fighting for, and created a legacy of love that would endure long after his money and power had faded into history. And through it all, she had never once regretted her choice. The wealthy rancher's daughter had chosen a drifting cowboy, had accepted her father's disownment with courage and grace, and in return had gained everything that truly mattered. She had gained herself, her freedom, and a love that sustained her through every challenge life brought her way. As the last light faded from the sky and the stars emerged in their full glory, Sophia leaned her head on Garrett's shoulder and smiled. This, she thought, this simple moment of peace and contentment surrounded by the family they had built together, was worth more than all the wealth in the world. She was exactly where she was meant to be, and she had not a single regret. The years continued to roll by, each one adding new chapters to the story of the Thornton family. As their children married and had children of their own, the small homestead became the center of a growing family network. Thomas built his house just over the hill, close enough to help with the family farm but far enough to maintain his independence. Clara returned from teaching in Boise to marry a local rancher, settling on land that bordered the Thornton property. Michael and James eventually divided the original homestead between them, each taking responsibility for different aspects of the operation, while still working together as they always had. Sophia found great joy in her role as grandmother, teaching her grandchildren the same lessons of independence and courage that had guided her own life. She told them stories of their grandfather's bravery, of how he had helped her escape a future she did not want, and had stood by her through every hardship. She taught the girls that they could be strong and capable, that they did not have to accept limitations others tried to place on them. She showed the boys that true strength came from gentleness and respect, from building up rather than tearing down. Garrett continued to work with horses well into his 70s, his hands perhaps less steady than they once were, but his eye for good bloodlines still sharp. He had developed a reputation throughout the territory for producing excellent working horses, and buyers came from as far away as Montana and Wyoming to purchase his stock. It gave him great satisfaction to know that his life's work was respected, that he had built something lasting through his own skill and effort. When they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered for a party that lasted from sunup to sundown. There was food and music, stories and laughter, and at the end of the evening, Garrett stood up to make a toast. 30 years ago, he said, his voice still strong despite his age, I was a drifting cowboy with nothing to my name but a horse and a bedroll. I had been searching for something my whole adult life without knowing what it was. And then, I met a young woman standing on a veranda, looking out at the horizon like she was dreaming of freedom. She gave up everything to take a chance on me, on us, on the possibility of building something real together. And look at what we built. He gestured around at the assembled family, at the prosperous farms visible in the distance, at the house they had expanded over the years into a comfortable home. This is what love and courage can build. Not wealth, not power, but family and purpose and a legacy that will outlast us both. Sophia, you have been the best partner a man could ask for. You have never once complained about the hardships, never looked back with regret at what you gave up. You took a chance on a drifting cowboy, and you made him into something better than he ever could have been alone. I love you today and always. There was not a dry eye in the gathering as Sophia stood and kissed her husband, their children and grandchildren applauding. It was a perfect moment, a crystallization of everything they had worked for and everything they had achieved together. As they moved into their 70s, age began to slow them both down. Garrett's joints ached in the cold weather, legacy of a lifetime of physical labor and old injuries never properly healed. Sophia's vision began to fail, making the close work she had always enjoyed increasingly difficult. But they adapted, as they had always adapted, finding new ways to contribute and new sources of joy. Garrett taught his grandsons everything he knew about horses, passing down knowledge accumulated over a lifetime. Sophia worked with her granddaughters in the kitchen, teaching them not just recipes, but the resourcefulness and creativity that had kept her family fed through lean times. Together, they remained the heart of the family, the foundation upon which 3 generations had been built. When Garrett passed away in his sleep at the age of 78, Sophia grieved deeply, but without bitterness. They had been granted more than 50 years together, years filled with love and purpose, and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. She missed him with an ache that never fully went away, but she took comfort in their children and grandchildren, in the legacy they had built together. She lived another 7 years, remaining sharp and engaged until the very end. On a warm spring morning, surrounded by family, she slipped away peacefully, her hand held by Clara, her face peaceful in death as it had been in life. At her funeral, Thomas stood to speak, this eldest son who had grown into a man of quiet strength and unwavering principle, so like his father in all the ways that mattered. "My mother," he said, "was the bravest person I ever knew. She gave up wealth and comfort and security to live a life of her own choosing. She faced hardships that would have broken lesser people, and she never once complained or regretted her choice. She taught us that freedom is worth fighting for, that love is stronger than money or power, and that the most important legacy we can leave is not what we accumulate, but how we live and who we love. The wealthy rancher's daughter chose a drifting cowboy, and in doing so, she built an empire far more valuable than the one she left behind. She built a family rooted in love and principle, and that legacy will endure long after all of us are gone. Sophia was buried beside Garrett on a hill overlooking the land they had claimed together so many years ago. The simple marker bore both their names and a single line. They chose freedom and found everything. In the years that followed, the Thornton family continued to grow and prosper. The grandchildren had children of their own, spreading throughout Idaho and beyond, carrying with them the stories of their remarkable grandparents. The trust fund established from Charles Fenwick's estate provided education and opportunities for generations of Thorntons, fulfilling Sophia's wish that her father's wealth be used to open doors rather than to bind. The original homestead remained in the family, passed down through the generations and carefully maintained. The small cabin that had been Garrett and Sophia's first home was preserved as a historical landmark, a testament to the courage and determination of the pioneers who had built Idaho from raw wilderness. And in time, the story of the wealthy rancher's daughter who chose a drifting cowboy became legend, told and retold around dinner tables and campfires. It became a reminder that the most valuable things in life cannot be bought or inherited, that true wealth is measured in love and freedom and the courage to choose your own path, whatever the cost. For Sophia had been right in the end. She had never regretted her choice, not for a single moment. She had traded a life of comfortable imprisonment for one of challenging freedom, and in doing so had discovered what it truly meant to be alive. She had loved deeply and been loved in return. She had built something lasting with her own hands and her own determination. And she had proven that courage and love are worth more than all the money in the world. That was her legacy, and it endured long after the last dollar of Charles Fenwick's fortune had been spent and forgotten. The story of her courage, of her love, of her refusal to be defined by others' expectations. That story lived on, inspiring new generations to claim their own freedom and build their own legacies. And in the end, what more could anyone ask than to be remembered with love and to leave the world a better place than they found it? Sophia and Garrett had done that. They had built a life of meaning and purpose from nothing but determination and love. They had raised children who understood the value of freedom and the importance of choosing your own path. And they had proven, beyond any doubt, that a wealthy rancher's daughter and a drifting cowboy could build an empire of the heart that would last forever.